So, for those that don't know me, I'm Ashley Farley. I'm a program officer of Knowledge and Research Services at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I've been there for about 8 years now, and my main remit is working on our open access policy and its implementation. Before that, I've worked. I'm a librarian by training and degree. I've worked in both academic and public libraries, and that's where I really started to learn more about access to information and see how it can really impact lives and communities. And then, through a bunch of connections, I ended up at the foundation, and I've been there, like I said, for 8 years, running our policy and working with grantees to make sure that they understand the policy, really what we're trying to aim for with it, and then be able to comply and increase our open access publishing numbers. So I think it made a lot of sense to us to sign on to DORA when it was announced. So we signed back in 2016. Our original policy launched in 2015. At the time, it was very much if there's an open access option, we will take it and pay for it. And at that time, a lot of the so-called known higher impact journals had no open access option, and so our grantees would be found non-compliant if they were to publish there, and the publications would then be behind a paywall. And so through those, kind of interactions and conversations, listening to grantees, the number one reason that would come up of really wanting to be able to publish in those journals is the high impact factor. And so instead of having the publication be a venue to be able to disseminate the research findings and be able to be built upon in the research ecosystem, it was very much a signifier for career advancement. And so as we had those conversations and saw kind of that dynamic, it definitely made sense that if we want to shift to a more, open access, a more collaborative versus competitive environment, that we are going to have to try to shift the research assessments. And I think it makes sense for us. We as a large organization, we grant, now at this point almost, over $7 billion in grant funding, and we want that funding to have a larger impact. It's going to have a larger impact if our grantees are thinking in more of a collaborative and open sharing way instead of being competitive and kind of focusing on that career advancement. So I think it made sense for us to signal our support and our want to be able to shift that incentive system away from only focusing on the articles and the impact factor of journals. So it made sense for us, and it gives us a real strong opportunity to be able to have these conversations, both with our program staff internally of why this is important, and with our grantees as well. Yeah, when I started this work, it was really fascinating to see even, the most senior researchers really didn't have a lot of in-depth knowledge on the publishing process, the traditional publishing process. And I think a lot of that is predicated in the fact that, when you think you get to the point of an article and then it's going through the submission process, there's usually just one person as a corresponding author ushering that article through the system. And I'm sure, through peer review, there's more collaboration there from all of the authors on the paper. But the process can be so arduous and time intensive that I understand when there's a point of like, I just want to get this thing done and published. Like it shouldn't, with the technology that we have available to us, when it's taking, 6 months to a year to get an article out there or accepted in a journal, I can understand why at the end of it, it's a process to kind of just try to fly through, say, the copyright transfer agreements, whether or not it'll be open access and just get it out there. So I can understand why that's not a higher priority for a lot of authors that just want to get the research out there, be able to put it on their CV and be able to move on. So I definitely understand that dynamic, but I do think, and we are trying to encourage authors, and especially our grantee authors, more to really think through what's happening in a lot of those components of the system. So the foundation is part of Coalition S. We're early adopters of Plan S, so that changed our policy starting January 1st of 2021. And a component of that is what we call the rights retention strategy. And it's, I think through the process, I feel like I've become a little bit of a de facto lawyer, but I'm not, not a lawyer. So, advising our grantees on rights retention and really trying to encourage them to think through what it means to sign, full copyright over to a publisher and what the implications of that might be, and why we would want them to be able to retain rights to their work but work with the publisher to be able to disseminate the work, and of course understand the importance of that. But it's been really fascinating to see that this is a huge shift in how authors think about their work and their publications and how it moves through the system. So I do think that they should care a lot more. I mean, the work and lead up from getting the grant to setting the project to executing and then taking the learnings and bundling up, that is an immense amount of work. And then to be able to, want to share that with the world, but to quickly kind of go through the processes and not consider licensing, reuse, and broad readability. I mean, there's so much studies out there that if your article is open access, you will, of course, get more readers and potentially more citations, and then it'll have a bigger impact in the research community. And I think that should be really enticing to any researcher to pay more attention to. I think what's great is just the awareness. So again, I think it's important for us to be signatories, because while we have a lot more work to do to really integrate the principles, it gives us something to point to as a conversation starter with our program staff and grantees. And I think especially from a funder perspective, that's critical. I think it's interesting when kind of the community talks about funders as a stakeholder in this community. Like, really, who a lot of funders are people from academia. So when you transition kind of into the funder role and you are now getting the grants and evaluating the research, you very much carry, I think, a lot of those biases that come from academia. And so working with program staff to get them to really interrogate those biases and get past kind of the assessment of where this is published has been really important. And so seeing the number of signatories that DORA has been able to get within 10 years and the global reach is really important. And I loved seeing kind of the different perspectives from different countries. I think it's very easy for especially us in the global north to get very used to the perspectives that we see in our researchers. And while we are a global organization and we give funding all over the world, it's we're often seeing the most privileged researchers publishing in the same way they always have. And I think it's good to be able to shift that focus to other country needs and other global needs, and focusing more on kind of a local level. So it was nice to see the whole range of perspectives through the DORA events. And then I appreciated too kind of the look forward of, we have had 10 years of this. I think many of us may feel that it's not enough quickly enough and want to really see that change, but it is going to take a long time. So acknowledging the work that is left to be done, I think was important as well. But even seeing, for example, another kind of institution funder, HHMI, had a session on removing journal names from the CVs and the work that they review. And while that's maybe a small move, it's going to have a huge impact. And so seeing those kind of examples and stories makes me feel a lot more positive that we are making change and moving in the right direction. Which is great, and I love that they have the different global perspectives, because I think that's an area that is something, especially at the foundation too, we're lacking, is that different perspective. And I think that overall, that's what we're starting to think, in future policy changes. So we are looking at changing our policy in 2025, and we want it to be, I think, much more equitable. Be kind of the first component that we look at. How we spend our money. Who's affected by our policy. I think in the past we very much have viewed it as we need to make sure, our research is openly available. So our researchers need to publish open access, but that has a broader ripple effect that I don't think we've really considered until now. And so I want to have a policy that has more of a positive impact on the entire ecosystem, and not just whether, it's research that's been funded in part or in whole by the foundation. I think something that we really need to see is more about the research itself, and less about the venue of publication. And I know I've been saying that my entire time at the foundation, but I do see examples where that's still not happening, and that certain journals or titles, and or even researchers will get more of a spotlight than others because of where it's published. And trying to change that cycle is hard. So I would love to be able to find ways that we can highlight good research that our researchers are doing, that are, published in a wide range of different journals and in different ways. Like, I would love to see us a shift from really that reliance on a version of record, and what does that mean? Because when talking about our policies, and when grantees do want to comply and are asking a lot of questions, I'm not hearing that it's important to publish in a specific journal, or the version of record's important because of its broader impact in getting the research out there. Again, it always kind of comes back to, I need to, for my institution, or the evaluation process I go through, publish in these journals, because this is what matters to our review community. And yeah, I think I think it'd be helpful just being more honest about that in these conversations. I think it's still kind of a really taboo topic to sometimes talk about, is journals and research assessment and that connection. And so I think making it so that researchers can feel more comfortable to have these conversations will go a long way in changing that discourse as well. So trying to talk about it more, and as a funder, like, what can we signal that we value, and what are the things that we're looking at and supporting, and how does that change the broader ecosystem? I mean, I think at this point we've all decided that we never meant to use, like, the impact factors, the quality stamp that it is now. And I think the publishers definitely benefited from being able to achieve kind of an easy metric that will get researchers' attention to continue to publish in that journal, or try to publish in that journal. So I think that's a fascinating dynamic. I mean, of course, impact factors aren't going to go away overnight. And I do think that there are other things that can be done. I mean, as far as trying to promote more, open access or open science, it's similar to, highlighting different and interesting research, and I think showing the value of what a publisher can bring to the research and the research community. We see like the really open access, open science friendly publishers that we work with that do this well really focus a lot on data sharing and helping grantees share their data and understand that. I think it's important to set strong policies around that, which can be a bit of a risk for publishers because it can turn researchers away if they don't want to share their data. But I do think that helps change the ecosystem in a strong way. And then as researchers see, is examples of strong research articles that have underlying data that can be, more openly built upon, or even, validated, interrogated in the research space. If researchers start to see that happen more often and then the benefits of it, I think that'll go a long way in changing the system more quickly. We're seeing more and more examples of some really interesting work being represented in the more open science journals. In general, it's interesting. I like to say that when I first started the foundation and started working in the open access community, if I had $1 for every time I heard, like, if the NIH just does something to have a more progressive open access policy, that'll really be the tipping point, and I could have retired already. But I'm truly excited because I didn't think it's something that would happen in my own career timeline. So I do think it's going to be a big shift, and it'll be interesting to see how the community and the publishers respond. So I do think that's helping us push forward in open access, but I still think we have a long way to go to make it become the norm. I mean, that was one of the impetuses of Coalition S, is that we're going to get a bunch of funders together. We're going to spend 5 years on having strong open access policy, and then we can close up shop, right? Because we'll have achieved open access publishing as the norm. And while we have seen shifts, we do see more options. I mean, now it's I think harder for our authors to not find an open access option that fulfills the policy or that we support. So that's all good, and that's trending in the right direction. But I think we have a long way to go to make it more equitable, make it be kind of the default. Like my dream is to get to a point where I'm not talking about open access anymore, because it is such a way that we now publish and do things. I would like to see, one of my goals is to kind of shift to focusing more on the open science aspect of it. So, what can we do to better support data sharing and other outputs? I still think the publications as they are now are important, and we, again, because of that career assessment and evaluation, it's important, and it is our main mechanism of disseminating information. But I would like to get us away from kind of that version of record, or that, thinking of the article as the container of information and the journal the container for the article, and how can we share and cultivate information in a much more interesting and reusable ways. And so that's something I'm very interested in. My next goals from a foundation perspective, again, we're kind of looking at our next policy iteration and how that can have a more positive effect on publishing as a whole, and then open science. So I really want to get to focusing more on sharing data and kind of different information artifacts than just the article, because I think that's where we'll really start to see some progress. I think the one positive of the pandemic is it did really show how the traditional publishing system failed to kind of react in the way that it typically works. And so we saw things become open. We saw, peer review happen much more quickly, or happen openly, or happen after publication. And I hope that we don't lose sight of what we learned during that time, because it does feel like we've kind of gone back to the before and how we've done things before then. And there are, of course, plenty of other crises that plague the world that we can do things differently, so that we can find interventions faster, quicker, and build up that trust in science as well.
Thanks very much. That was very interesting for me, and I think for a lot of other people who get to listen to this, it will be. So yeah, we really appreciate your time.
Yeah,
Thanks very
thank you for the
much.
opportunity. And yeah, and if it, I'm happy to answer any questions that people get, or can reach out. Always happy to engage with the community.
Thanks. We really appreciate that. Thank you. Then have a good day and enjoy the
Yes, you as
sunshine.
well. Take care.
All right.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.